Imagine being humiliated in front of your patient by someone you trust, someone in a position of power, no less. That's exactly what happened to one dedicated nurse when a respected doctor publicly embarrassed her, belittling her work in front of a patient. But here's the twist. What the doctor didn't know was that the patient wasn't just any ordinary person. In fact, they were about to find out that their actions would have serious consequences. It all started during a routine checkup. The nurse, doing her best to ensure the patient's comfort and safety, was suddenly confronted by a doctor who, without warning, began to challenge her every decision in front of the patient. He mocked her professionalism, questioning her skills in a way that no one should have to endure, especially not in front of a patient who was there for care, not drama. As the tension in the room built, the nurse stood there, powerless, trying to maintain her composure. But what neither the doctor nor the nurse could have predicted was the true identity of the patient, someone whose influence and connections could shake the foundations of the hospital they worked in. How would the doctor react when the truth came to light? Could this moment of humiliation turn into a life-changing revelation? Stay tuned to find out how this story unfolds. To understand what led to this heated moment, we need to take a step back. Nurse Lisa had always been a professional, known for her calm demeanor and thorough care. She loved her job, and patients trusted her. She had worked at the hospital for years, earning respect from colleagues and patients alike. But her experience, her dedication, hadn't stopped her from facing challenges in the workplace. Dr. Thompson, the doctor in charge that day, had a reputation for being demanding, sometimes to a fault. He wasn't one to tolerate mistakes or second-guessing, and while some saw him as a brilliant doctor, others feared his sharp tongue and high expectations. Over time, a tension had started to build between him and Lisa, but neither had ever truly addressed it, until now. The patient in question, a man who looked perfectly ordinary at first glance, had checked into the hospital that morning for a routine checkup. He had no obvious connection to anyone in the medical field, and yet something about him seemed different. He watched the interaction between Dr. Thompson and Nurse Lisa carefully, his eyes sharp as if he could sense the rising tension in the room. As the doctor's words grew harsher, the man's posture shifted. He had been quiet until now, but something in his gaze seemed to communicate a message. He knew more than he was letting on. Lisa, though rattled, kept her professional composure, unaware that this man was not just a patient, but someone whose life and influence could turn this situation upside down. What did he know? And how would the doctor react when he finally found out? The stakes were higher than anyone realized. As the tension in the room mounted, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Dr. Thompson's voice, harsh and demeaning, echoed in her ears. He wasn't just questioning her medical judgment. He was undermining her in front of the patient. She had been through difficult situations before, but this felt different, personal, almost. She clenched her fists, silently pleading with herself to hold it together. The patient, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned forward in his chair. His calm expression betrayed none of the tension that simmered in the air. Lisa noticed the shift in his demeanor. Something had changed. It wasn't the first time she had sensed that a patient's reaction to the doctors or nurses might be influenced by something deeper. But today, it felt as if this man knew more than he was letting on. Dr. Thompson, clearly frustrated by Lisa's refusal to respond to his verbal jabs, crossed his arms. "I don't know why you're so defensive, nurse," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's simple. You either know what you're doing or you don't." His words cut through the room, and Lisa felt every syllable sink into her chest. But it was the patient's next move that threw her off balance. He straightened in his seat, his eyes locking onto Dr. Thompson with an intensity that made the air feel thick. "Doctor," the man said calmly, his voice low yet firm. "I think you're the one who's confused." Dr. Thompson froze. The words hung in the air, unanswered. The patient didn't break eye contact, his gaze unwavering. Lisa was confused. Who was this man? What did he know? Why was he suddenly challenging the doctor like this? The patient turned toward Lisa, his face softening for the first time since their interaction began. "You've been doing fine," he told her, his tone reassuring. "Don't let him get to you." Lisa was taken aback. She hadn't expected support, not in this situation. But as she looked back at Dr. Thompson, something shifted in the doctor's face. It was subtle, but it was there, recognition. Fear. The doctor's confidence faltered for just a moment, and in that split second, Lisa realized that the man sitting across from them was no ordinary patient. Could he be someone important? Someone with power? Her mind raced, but before she could process her thoughts further, Dr. Thompson cleared his throat, visibly regaining his composure. "If you're finished, we'll continue with the examination," he said curtly, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But the tension had already shifted, and Lisa couldn't help but wonder, had the doctor just made an enemy in the wrong person? She glanced at the patient, who was now calm but guarded. His true identity was still a mystery, but one thing was certain: this encounter was far from over. The room felt charged with unspoken history, and Lisa could sense that both her career and the doctor's future were hanging by a thread. As the examination continued, the weight of the silence in the room was almost suffocating. Lisa's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had he stepped in so boldly? And why did Dr. Thompson seem so rattled by him? The doctor, who was usually so in control, now appeared visibly unsettled, his previously harsh demeanor faltering with every word. Lisa could sense the change in the air, like a storm brewing just out of sight. Dr. Thompson's hands shook slightly as he took the patient's vitals, but he quickly regained his composure, masking it with a stiff smile. His eyes flicked back to the patient more than once, as though searching for some sort of clue, something that could explain the unease now creeping into his every movement. The tension between the two men was palpable, but the doctor, unwilling to acknowledge his discomfort, pushed forward, determined to finish the examination without further incident. The patient, however, wasn't done. He was studying Dr. Thompson closely, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Every move the doctor made seemed to be under scrutiny, as if the patient was measuring every word, every action. Lisa couldn't help but feel like a bystander to a much larger game she didn't fully understand. It was as if both of these men were playing roles in a drama she had only just stumbled into. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, the patient's voice broke the silence once more. "You know, Dr. Thompson, it's interesting. You don't remember me, do you?" he said, his voice low but filled with a heavy, almost knowing tone. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Thompson's face went pale. The shift in his expression was so sharp it sent a chill through the room. He stepped back, the stethoscope in his hands now dangling loosely by his side. His mouth opened and closed as if he was struggling to find the right words. For the first time since the encounter began, Dr. Thompson looked genuinely scared. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold sweat that clung to his brow. Lisa glanced between the two men, confused, yet aware that something monumental was unfolding before her. The patient's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You don't remember, do you? Well, I'll remind you." Lisa's pulse quickened. She had a sinking feeling that whatever this man was about to say could bring everything crashing down. On Dr. Thompson, on her, on the hospital itself. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer just about an embarrassing confrontation between a doctor and a nurse. It was about something far more significant, something that could change their lives forever. Let's just say, the patient continued, that I'm someone who can make your world very small, very fast. His words hung in the air, sharp and ominous, as Lisa's mind raced to comprehend what was happening. Dr. Thompson's hand clenched into a fist at his side, but he didn't speak. His gaze never left the patient, his face a mixture of confusion and dread. What did this man know? And why was he so sure of his power over the doctor? The room felt like it was holding its breath. Lisa could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever came next would be the tipping point. Dr. Thompson had crossed a line, but what consequences would he face now? She couldn't help but wonder if the doctor was about to lose everything. The tension in the room thickened as the patient's words hung in the air, almost like a thread, yet coated with an unsettling calm. Lisa couldn't tear her eyes away from the interaction. Her heart pounded in her chest, each second stretching into an eternity. Dr. Thompson's face, once a mask of arrogance, now twisted in confusion and disbelief. He was no longer in control of the situation. This man, whoever he was, held all the cards. Just as Lisa thought the moment couldn't become any more charged, the door to the examination room swung open without warning. The sharp click of heels echoed in the silence. It was a woman, tall and poised, with an air of authority that instantly demanded attention. She stepped in without even acknowledging Lisa or Dr. Thompson, her eyes locked on the patient. Lisa's breath caught. The woman's presence alone felt like another puzzle piece clicking into place. She wasn't just any hospital administrator or colleague. Her sharp, businesslike manner left no room for doubt. This was someone with power, a power that could easily erase careers and reputations. "Mr. Crawford," the woman said smoothly, her voice filled with an edge that made the air grow colder. "I see you've been keeping Dr. Thompson on his toes. I trust you're satisfied with his service." The doctor's face went white at the mention of the name. Crawford. Lisa had heard that name whispered in the hospital hallways, but never in such a direct context. The last time she had heard it, it had been tied to rumors of a wealthy, influential figure with connections that could stretch from the highest levels of government to the most exclusive corporate circles. Her mind raced. Mr. Crawford. Could this really be the same person? The patient she'd been so focused on wasn't just some high-ranking executive. He was someone with enough influence to bring down an entire medical department if he wanted to. Lisa looked at Dr. Thompson, whose hands had gone clammy, his lips trembling as he glanced from Crawford to the woman standing at the door. The woman, who was clearly well aware of the tension, smiled coldly. "I trust you're aware, Doctor, that Mr. Crawford has a rather particular standard of care." Her words dripped with implication, and in that moment, Lisa understood that this wasn't just about an insult in front of a patient. This was about power, money, and the unspoken alliances that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Thompson cleared his throat, but it was a poor attempt at regaining composure. Yes, of course." He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. He was unraveling before their eyes, his earlier bravado completely gone. But Lisa wasn't prepared for what happened next. Crawford's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward in his chair, his voice smooth and deliberate. "You should know, Dr. Thompson," he said, each word weighted with a cold, deliberate finality. "I've been keeping a very close eye on your methods for some time now. And frankly, I've been disappointed." The words hit like a slap, and Lisa could almost feel the room shift, as if the walls were closing in on them. The stakes were higher than ever. What had seemed like a simple confrontation was now a battle for the doctor's career, his reputation, and maybe more. Dr. Thompson's face betrayed his panic. The patient wasn't just someone who could make his life difficult. He was someone with the power to destroy it. And as the woman at the door stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, it was clear that things were about to get even more complicated. "Consider this a warning, doctor," the woman continued, her voice steady but carrying a threat that made the air grow colder still. "You've made a mistake. And now the consequences will be yours to face." Lisa watched in disbelief as Dr. Thompson stood frozen, the color draining from his face. He knew this was it. The walls were closing in, and he couldn't escape what was coming. But Lisa was left wondering. Where did this leave her? Would she be caught in the crossfire? And what did this powerful figure, Mr. Crawford, really want from them all? Every second was a countdown now, and Lisa had no idea how the pieces would fall, but she knew one thing. Things were about to get a lot darker. The room was thick with tension, every word from Mr. Crawford, and the woman standing at the door landing like a hammer blow. Dr. Thompson's face had drained of all color. He had been exposed. His arrogance, his sense of control, all of it had shattered in the face of someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. Lisa stood there, frozen, unsure whether she should be relieved or fearful for the doctor. But deep down, she knew this moment was bigger than both of them. Crawford's cold smile never faltered as he stood up from his chair. "I've been patient with you, doctor. I truly have. But I can't ignore the lapses in care that have been building up. Not when lives are on the line." His voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. The woman beside him remained silent, her presence somehow amplifying the gravity of the moment. Lisa felt like a spectator in her own life as the confrontation unfolded. She had witnessed plenty of disagreements between doctors, but this was something else. Crawford wasn't just a patient. He was a force. Dr. Thompson was completely out of his depth, struggling to stay composed in the face of someone who had the power to crush him in an instant. The silence stretched on, only broken by the soft click of Crawford's fingers as he tapped on the armrest of his chair. "I'm giving you a choice, Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice suddenly colder. "You can either walk away from this, or I'll make sure you never practice medicine again. Your reputation, your career, it'll all be gone." Just like that. Dr. Thompson's lips parted in disbelief, but no words came out. The weight of Crawford's words hung over him, suffocating him. It was clear now this wasn't just a matter of a single insult. Crawford held the kind of power that could ruin someone's life with the flick of a wrist, and the doctor knew it. But just as it seemed like Dr. Thompson might crumble under the pressure, the unexpected happened. Lisa, who had been standing silently until then, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Crawford," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, both Crawford and the woman turned their gaze toward her. Crawford raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone dripping with curiosity. Lisa met his eyes, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. "Yes, Dr. Thompson may not be perfect, but he's not the one who needs to be punished here. I think you've made a grave mistake." She glanced at Dr. Thompson, who was staring at her in shock. But this was her moment, and she couldn't back down now. "I know who you are, Mr. Crawford," she continued. "And I know what you've been doing to manipulate the system. The lapses in care you're referring to, those weren't caused by Dr. Thompson. They were caused by people you've been using for your own gain. People who were pushed too far by someone in your position." Crawford's face hardened. "What are you implying, nurse?" Lisa didn't flinch. "You've been using your power to get away with mistakes, to cover up the negligence of the very people you've entrusted with care. And now you're trying to turn the tables on Dr. Thompson because he's the one who started asking questions. This isn't about him. It's about you. The woman beside Crawford stiffened, her eyes flashing with sudden realization. Crawford's confident demeanor cracked for the briefest of moments as he tried to regain control of the situation. But Lisa's words had cut deep. The calm, calculated man who had held all the power now looked vulnerable, exposed in a way he hadn't been before. Dr. Thompson, still stunned, finally found his voice. "I had no idea," he muttered, his tone low, almost apologetic. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Crawford's gaze shifted from Lisa to the woman at the door, his expression unreadable. "You should have kept quiet, nurse," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You've just made a powerful enemy." But Lisa didn't back down. "The truth always comes out eventually," she said, her voice firm. "And you can't hide behind your money and influence forever." In that moment, everything shifted. The woman at the door took a step back, her cold expression faltering. For the first time, it was clear that Crawford wasn't in control anymore. The doctor, the nurse, and even Crawford himself were caught in a web they couldn't escape. And just as the tension seemed unbearable, the final twist came. The door to the room opened again, and this time, it wasn't just another doctor or administrator. A group of law enforcement officers entered, led by someone who had been waiting quietly outside the entire time. Someone Lisa hadn't noticed until now. An investigator who had been tracking Crawford's illegal activities for months. "Mr. Crawford," the investigator said, his voice cold and authoritative, "you're under arrest for your role in manipulating hospital records, bribery, and negligence that led to the deaths of several patients." Lisa felt her heart stop, the truth crashing down with a finality that left no room for doubt. Crawford's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. The powerful figure who had controlled everything was now the one in cuffs. Dr. Thompson stared, speechless. Lisa, too, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to feel. The confrontation had ended, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The hospital would be under investigation, lives would be forever changed, and the truth had finally come to light in the most unexpected way. As the officers led Crawford out of the room, Lisa glanced at Dr. Thompson. He was no longer the doctor who had belittled her. He was a man caught up in a scandal he never saw coming. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: no one was leaving this hospital the same way they came in. As the officers escorted Crawford out of the room, Lisa stood still, her heart racing. She could hardly believe what had just happened. The truth had come to light, and the powerful man who had caused so much harm was finally being held accountable. It felt surreal, like the weight of the moment had yet to settle in. Dr. Thompson, too, remained silent, his face a mix of shock and confusion. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the room just hours ago. He had been forced to confront the reality of his own role in a much larger, more dangerous game. The woman who had entered with Crawford had vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind only the lingering tension of her presence. Lisa felt a wave of relief, but also something deeper, something that told her she'd just stepped into a new chapter of her life, one where she couldn't remain silent anymore. She had spoken up when it mattered most, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of justice that went beyond the walls of the hospital. In the following days, the hospital was shaken to its core. Investigations into Crawford's dealings spread far and wide, exposing years of corruption that had been hidden beneath the surface. Dr. Thompson, while no longer the villain of the story, would have to face the consequences of his own involvement. His career would never be the same, but perhaps, just maybe, he had learned a valuable lesson in humility. Lisa's life, too, had changed. The courage she'd shown in speaking up had earned her the respect of many, and she was no longer just another nurse in the background. She was a voice for truth in a system that had too long ignored the people who mattered most, the patients. In the end, the story wasn't just about a doctor's downfall or a patient's power. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Lisa knew she had done just that.